Dutch and the Portuguese, they were heavily involved in the transatlantic slave trade of Africans. The Portuguese were among the first Europeans trading in captured Africans. They initiated as well a large-scale European involvement in the trade. Nobody was doing it as big as them. These are the Portuguese. We even had the Arabs and Africans were also involved in the trading of kidnapped Africans long before the Europeans got involved. After Portugal, then we had other European nations now in the whole business of the transatlantic slave trade. We have nations like Spain that participated in the early 1500s of the trade. Then France, who got involved in the 16th century. Then England, they become prominent in the 17th century in the slave trade. The Netherlands, they got involved in the 17th century as well. Portugal started their connection, started around 1441 for them, where they were capturing Africans from the west coast of Africa. Right? That would be like the modern area of Mauritania, Senegal, that kind of area there. These captured Africans, these kidnapped Africans, they would primarily sell them to Portugal itself. So the traders, the Portuguese traders, they would sell them to Portugal. Lisbon, which is the capital of Portugal, they were heavily involved in the business of selling Africans because Lisbon was a major hub. The Lisbon slave market, it would attract buyers from the Portuguese colonists who were doing their business in Brazil and the Atlantic islands, such as, the Canary Islands, the Cape Verde Islands, the Madeira, those Atlantic islands there. Other people who went to that slave market to do trading of Africans. The Spanish were involved in that, and European merchants like the Dutch and the French, they were involved in it as well. The Dutch, they later played a very significant role in the transatlantic slave trade, especially in providing kidnapped people to the Caribbean and South America. The Dutch and the Portuguese, they both had colonies and trading posts, right, set up, and they relied heavily on enslaved Africans. In the 16th century, shortly after Spain colonized Jamaica in 1509, they brought enslaved Africans to the island. And this practice of having enslaved people, kidnapped people, continued under the British from 1655 until emancipation in 1834. But while this was happening, things were slowly changing. In the height of slavery, the wind of change was blowing. And the first change that occurred in the practice of trading kidnapped Africans, the first change that we saw in 1807, the British abolished the slave trade. But the slave trade act really only applied to the British Empire. Even though they tried pressuring other European countries, that were involved in the practice to stop, but the act was really geared towards British ships being involved in the trade. Then the next thing that we see is the abolishing of slavery in the Americas. And this was a result of various factors and events, such as the Haitian Revolution that took place between 1791 and 1804, which brought about the successful slave revolt. Then the British Abolition Act of 1833, which emancipated slaves in the British colonies, including Jamaica, although that came in effect in 1834. Then we have the Emancipation Act of 1863 that was issued by some US president. And we have the US Amendment that abolished slavery in the US in 1865. But let me just raise some points that also influence the ending of slavery, and not just the things that I just mentioned. One, we have cheaper sugar products. The competition from beet sugar and other sugar producers. It affected the importance or the dominance of Caribbean sugar economics. Next, we have the industrialization of Britain. The Industrial Revolution of Britain shifted economic focus from what used to be a slave-based economy to a wage economy. And that made the slave trade or the slave labor not as critical as how it was. So new technology like steam engines, factories that boosted production, that helped to shift from colonies' dependence to industrial production. You see, slavery was a big part of the earlier mercantile system where colonies would supply the raw materials. But as the industry grew in Britain, the economy became less dependent on slave labor. And now, they're more focused on manufacturing, trading goods, goods like textile, instead of relying heavily on slave-produced commodities. Slave-produced commodities would be like sugar, tobacco, cotton, dyes, right? Because dyes were a very important product, right? So you see, industrialization kind of take the emphasis of these slave-produced commodities, and they were now focused on manufacturing and the trading of goods and stuff. So it wasn't just about the moral of the slave trade, slavery. What brought about a big change is the economic aspect, or the desire to move away from slave labor. Another aspect is the humanitarian aspect. So we're talking about abolitionist movements that push the morality argument against slavery. So we start seeing the rise of people like William Wilberforce, an abolitionist movement in the late 18th century. Example, the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade. Their acronym would be CEAST. So they were playing this big role in agitation from a humanitarian aspect, right? And their approach was that they highlighted the brutal treatment of the enslaved Africans and the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade. Example like the Middle Passage. And they also highlight the inhumane conditions that they were exposed to. But let me add this. The Haitian independence disrupted trade patterns, and the Christmas rebellion led by Sam Sharp, they also played a role in the drafting of the Emancipation Act. To be honest with you, I have heard many times spoken about the Christmas rebellion, and I have never really seen it any different from the other rebellions that took place, but it's in doing this research that I come to realize how important, of a contribution that rebellion made into bringing about the end of slavery, or bringing about the Emancipation Act being drafted. Then 1865, the US 13th Amendment that brought about the end of slavery, right, on paper. The key changes are, in all of this, is the industrialists, people who know were getting into industrialism. They wanted free labor of factories without the competing slave labor. Then you had great thinkers. So you have this man called Adam Smith. I think they refer to him as the father of modern day economics. So great thinkers like these people, they start put forth theories, and they promoted free labor and trade. As industrial growth took place, it reduced reliance on colonial slave economies. That's how Britain was shifting away from the plantation economics to a more industrial approach. As I said, this was not done suddenly. This was a gradual move. All right, so free labor. As I talk about free labor, you offer your labor freely, and you work for a wage, and you are legally, you're free to quit, theoretically, and you're not forced or coerced into having to stay on the job. That's the whole idea of free labor, and that's what the industrialists wanted, that idea, to push that idea, as opposed to what they want to move away from, which would be the opposite of free labor, which is the slave labor, where, as you know, the slave labor involves people, they're forced to work, they don't get wages, right? So they're not paid, or they're underpaid, and they're treated as property. So while they offered the enslaved people freedom through the Emancipation Act, they had a caveat in there. There was conditions to it. So in August 1st, 1834, the time was laid down by Britain for emancipation of enslaved African people. So it was like offering the people freedom, but with strings attached. It's like basically an apple with a worm in it. One of the condition is only the young children would get freedom on this date. So when August 1st roll in, is only the young children who get full freedom on this date. Everybody else, there's conditions. So you're talking about like the children them that belong to like the picnic gang, they would automatically get full freedom. But for everybody else, there are conditions. As for the kidnapped, enslaved, born into slavery African, categorized as predial or non-predials, they would have to go through a period of what is called apprenticeship for 6 and 4 years, respectively. And this was all planned by the local authorities to go this way. All right, so the Emancipation Act, the act itself determined the period of apprenticeship that was written in it. But they allowed the local government, like the Planters Assembly, to decide if they want to go with this or not. They want to go with apprenticeship or choose full freedom. Antigua was the only island went straight to emancipation without any apprenticeship. Let me just explain now what apprenticeship was basically. Apprenticeship, it was like a tool, like a transitionary tool. And it was used by the colonial administration and the assemblies. What they were afraid of, you see, is that they didn't want sugar plantation economic system to collapse. Because they were afraid that if the ex-enslaved people who are now apprentice, if they walk away from the plantation, it would cause a labor crisis and resulting into a disruption in the industry that would be bad for business. So in other words, the British, they're willing to set the people them free, but with little risk. They want to eat their cake and still have it. This fear caused the assembly in every other colony, British colony, except Antigua, to pass a set of police laws, which was critical to make the apprenticeship system work according to how it was laid out in the Emancipation Act. All right, one of the law, it says that the enslaved African or the emancipated enslaved African or ex-slave or apprentice would work 40.5 hours per week for free. And overtime, anything over that, they'll be paid for. This should ring a bell. That this 40-hour work week that we're presently using in our labor structure, in our labor model, this is where it comes from. Right from here, right from slavery. That's why the inheritance from slavery is 40-hour week. But in this case, we are paid 40 hours. But when this was tabled, when this was passed, this was free work, 40 hours a week. The masters them allow the ex-slave to keep them homes and they still give them rations. Some plantation owners say, boy, they can work with the 40.5 week because it benefit them more. Still keep, such as the old people and the children them and all of that. It's a nice little trade-off because when they will benefit from the 40.5 or they can cover all expenses. So some planters were happy with that. But that goes for the plantation, that goes for the islands, you see, that didn't have that land. So people, they didn't have anywhere to go because land was scarce. So in those places, you don't have anywhere to go, so you gotta stay up on the plantation. Right? So they see how they could benefit from the 40.5. Reason behind the whole apprenticeship thing is that colonial office, they thought that without apprenticeship, colonies would collapse into miserable poverty. Additionally, over a century of the islands, those colonies under plantocracy, they had no services that a free society would need to exist. So they were in a dilemma there. At some point, they have a full free society, but yet there's no services. It's not a real country. These colonies were not a real place. They just exist as, could I just use the term as like factory? where you just extract. So because majority of the people who lived there were not really human. They didn't consider them as human in their eyes. So it was not about setting up any services to structure a society or society is supposed to be structured. It was more about just extract, about money, the money, the money, the money. So now that they're looking at making this move now, where they would have coming on them a sort of like a free society where things are going to change. Now they're thinking that they need to have structures in place to accommodate this kind of move, this kind of paradigm shift. But as I said before, over 100 years of plantocracy, there were no services in place. There were very few roads, hardly any hospitals, no school, no orphanages. So, as I said before, these people just focusing on just what they could extract out of the colonies, not putting anything back. The thought that the services could be provided, these things that are concerning the authority now. So boy, we have all these people, we have to cater for them. And they're thinking that if we can keep the economy of the colony continuing, the export of the plantation crops to earn money, they're thinking that within 4 to 6 years of apprenticeship should somewhat help them along that way. Plus, it would also teach the apprentices or the newly freed enslaved people how to become a good little wage earning plantation worker. Also to that, they were hoping that they could make changes with law is concerned, because they were kind of worried about that they becoming free, the anger and the hate that have been in these people, or they think that's in these people, they would take it out on them. So they were worried about the ex-enslaved outbreak of violence against their farmer, plantation owners and masters. So they were hoping that this spread of apprenticeship would give them enough time to fix those little areas, right, that they were worried about. Right? And also they want that time as a little leeway to start create new laws to govern public order, to replace old police laws. These old police laws existed during slavery. Let me give you some example of what I'm talking about when I say old police laws. 1, curfews. Enslaved had to be off the streets by sundown. 2, the movement restriction. They needed passes to move between plantation. They were banned on assembly. Nobody couldn't group. They couldn't stop the group or have a discussion. No. There was a ban on that. Right? So the group thing of enslaved people were prohibited. Punishments. Punishment them would have come in the form of whipping if you're disobedient. So if something wrong and you talk about it, they can view that as disobedience. You get lashings for that. Punishment comes in the form of branding. They brand you. Or they brand you to show ownership. Then you have the execution of people who starts rebellion. Because if you notice, a lot of the enslaved Africans who have agitated and started rebellion, they're always executed. Some of them are executed and have them head chopped off, or those straight execution. And not only just instigators of rebellions were executed, but if you run away and them catch up, right? You were killed. And then no legal rights. So as an enslaved person, you were not recognized as human under the law. You have no rights as a human being. And as I mentioned last week, that the right as a free person or what makes you human legally is that you have to have the right to freedom, you have to have the right to autonomy, you have to have the right to dignity, right to family, education, and you can own property. None of these things could happen under slavery because you're not considered human. All right, so what happens now when the Emancipation Proclamation was publicly announced or proclaimed to the people who they're about to free? When they read the proclamation and that part about the apprenticeship was announced, they no apprentice because they're apprentice now, because the law come in effect, so they're apprentice now, whether they like it, yes or no. The ex-enslaved apprentice, they objected vehemently about the idea of apprenticeship. In Trinidad, the authorities had to call out the militia to restore order. Just because of their militant reaction to the apprenticeship announcement, and they were calling, jeering, mocking the governor and accusing him and the system that he represents. They were using term of they're a set of damn thieves and them are all rogue. And I can tell you, back in that time, using these words would be equivalent to we using what we class bad words in our time. So that happened in Trinidad. In St. Kitts and Montserrat, the people them rioted as well. In Jamaica, the unwilling, no apprentices, they were rounded up and taken back to the plantation. And in British Guyana, they made the move of appointing amongst the apprentices, amongst the ex-enslaved people, they would appoint a few of the apprentices and make them into constables. They call them special constables, right? With the task to now go and persuade the others, to talk them into it. So like an Uncle Tom kind of thing, to persuade the rest of the apprentices now to return to the plantation. Because of what was taking place, the local authority, they wanted now to make the move of how can they make this go as smooth as they can, as smooth as possible. Because they were set on making this thing working. There's no two ways about it. This thing had to work. So what the colonial office came up with, because they wanted the apprenticeship thing to be carried out fairly, or what they call fair, they created this category of people called the special magistrates and send them to the Caribbean. And these special magistrates, they would be selected from retired like military people and civil servants. So they created special magistrates now come to oversee, supervise this transition from being a slave into being an apprentice. And after a certain amount of years, then you become fully free. So it's like a two-step program. So the magistrates came, and even though they wanted to be fair, to give the apprentice justice, but the real essence is that they really came to ensure the continuation of the plantation system. Why I say that is because they still had to enforce the laws of the Apprenticeship Act. I'm going to tell you some of the laws that was built into the apprenticeship to keep the people in order, in line, to allow the apprenticeship thing to work. So you have law like the vagrancy law, which made it illegal for the apprentice to leave the plantation even during them free time. They couldn't leave if them don't have permission from their masters or overseers. Another law is that it made it difficult for apprentices to buy their freedom within that time. So, what is this emancipation all about? It was just a farce. They use other strategies as well, right, to keep the apprentices where they are. Strategies like they would charge for licenses. So if you want to carry out your trade, because remember that during the slavery system, you had the artisans. So these were skilled people. So if you wanted to ply your trade, you would have to get license to do so. And these licenses carry hefty charges, right? So if you're a carpenter, you're a barrel maker, you're a mason, you're a blacksmith, you couldn't get work anywhere else because you can't afford it. You couldn't become an independent businessman. So where is the only place you could survive, to take care of yourself, to feed, to clothe and shelter yourself? Where else? Back to the plantation. Another strategy that they used was, if you had a liquor shop or you're a fisherman, these operations were heavily taxed. That's another strategy of keeping them where they are. Higgling was discouraged by high fees to use the local market. But here's another one. So you did get a license, right, as a trader, but there was a law there that says you needed a different trade license for each parish. So it's not just only just getting a license, but as a tradesperson, if I live in St. Catherine, I may get a license operating in St. Catherine. If me go to Kingston, I have to get another license to go to Kingston to work. And you know the funny thing about it? In Jamaica at that time, you had 21 parishes, not like now we're at 14. All right, so the nature of these laws, you see, these laws were done this way because the people that were involved, I was creating these laws. The groups that were involved, such as the colonial administration, the planters assembly, and let me give you an idea of the people who made up, say, the House of Assembly in Jamaica. These people were planters, large landowners, and they were mainly white, and merchants. So these were big businessmen, and they have ties to Britain. So these groups, the colonial administration, the planters assembly, the House of Assembly, they all made laws favoring their interest, not the apprentice interest. Just want to share some additional info with you. The British Slavery Act was passed in August 28, 1833, and that act abolished slavery in the British colonies. But It took effect in August the 1st, 1834. So the act was passed in 1833 on the 28th of August, but emancipation came into effect August the 1st, 1834. You see what's happening there? Almost a year later. All right, so let me give you some breakdown in emancipation issues in other European countries, colonies, because emancipation that I've been talking about, the emphasis is mostly on the British side of slavery, because we tend to think about just the British colonies. But yes, other people were living under different systems in other colonies, under other countries. In terms of emancipation, Denmark, Norway, they passed their Emancipation Act in 1792 and it became effective in 1803. France in 1848. Spain, emancipation came in 1886 for Cuba and Puerto Rico. Portugal in 1869, and the Netherlands, which is the Dutch people, in 1863. So that's just a quick rundown in terms of the factors, circumstances, the push that led up to emancipation, and how emancipation wasn't clear-cut as though it should be, because there were caveats to it, there were conditions to it, and those caveats, for whatever reasons, created the apprenticeship system. And the apprenticeship system, it came into effect in 1834, and by 1840, apprenticeship should have ended. But because of the inhumane and exploitive behavior of these plantation owners during this period of time, they say that the apprenticeship period was worse in terms of inhumane treatment in the latter stage of slavery, moving into the emancipation period. All right, so as a result of that, it did not go up to 1840. They had to cap it and give everybody full emancipation in 1838. And that's why today we celebrate Emancipation Day, August the 1st, 1838. So this brings me to the end of the presentation.